Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we will be looking at a vintage piece from Seiko that definitely has the look with the funky case shape. But does the quality of the time hold up to today, 45 years after it was made back in 1977? Keep watching to find out if it really is built different. This is a vintage Seiko Type 2 quartz. Quartz watches today are often looked down upon by enthusiasts and collectors, as they are seen as inferior and without the soul that a mechanical watch has. This is largely to do with the fact that many of the movements in these watches are mass-produced for probably just a few cents in China. This watch comes from a time when quartz movements were not so cheaply mass-produced and made. Seiko took pride in their quartz movements back in the 70s and 80s and made them to a much higher standard than what you see today. Many of these movements are completely serviceable, and as you can see from the fact that this one is still running almost half a century later, will keep ticking reliably for a long time. So, before we move on to the watch itself, let's have a quick look at the history of Seiko and their relationship with the quartz movement. There is an event that began in 1969 called the Quartz Crisis. This is the result of one watch which almost single-handedly destroyed the Swiss watch industry. It began with the first quartz watch, the Astron, released by Seiko. This watch replaced the mechanical movement powering a watch with one that used a battery and a quartz crystal to track time. This new movement was infinitely more accurate than any mechanical watch. Advancements in this technology and manufacturing processes eventually led to the quartz movements we know today, infinitely cheaper and basically disposable when compared to a mechanical watch. Even today, Seiko continue to develop this technology, with their 9F Grand Seiko quartz movements being immaculately finished with homegrown quartz crystals inside and a double-step motor to ensure that there is no wobble to the second hand as it ticks. Even the spring drive movement could be considered a quartz movement of sorts, combining many features of mechanical and quartz movements together to create a proprietary movement that winds like an automatic watch, is as accurate as a quartz watch, and has a second hand like no other. Taking a look at the watch now, and more specifically the dial, we are presented with what I think is a fantastic green dial that changes dramatically when it catches the light at different angles. With green being a very popular color over the last few years for dials, you could say that Seiko were ahead of their time with this one. Looking more closely at the dial, we see that it actually features a very subtle and very fine vertical brushing, which is what gives it that striking color change from deep green to bright green. The Seiko logo is applied above the pinion with quartz proudly printed underneath. Below that, we can see another applied logo with the words Type 2, as well as the Daini Seikosha factory logo, which was also present on the mosaic pattern of my Grand Seiko Anniversary Limited Edition. This Type 2 branding marks Seiko's mid-range watches from the time, higher quality and more accurate than their regular models, but not as good as something like a King or Grand Quartz. As mentioned, quartz technology was not that old at the time and was still quite expensive. Zooming back out a little, there is the day-date complication at the 3 o'clock position, making this functional as an everyday watch. Whilst initially looking like they might be loomed, the hands on this watch are actually just painted white. They are classic fence post style hands, and as you can see, the hour hand has a bevel going down the middle. While the needle second hand is completely white, the hour and minute hands have a brushed center section which, in a certain light, can make the white hands look like they're floating over the dial. Another sign of the quality of this movement is the fact that the second hand is hitting the minute markers perfectly as it goes around the dial, something modern, cheap movements struggle with. Watching in slow motion, there is no perceptible shake to the second hand as it moves, just like modern Grand Seiko. However, I don't think this is achieved using the same two-step motor system. The markers it is hitting are printed on an angled chapter ring that can often look black, but is actually a very dark, very rich green color. Notice how it has a slight cutout to fit the date window. Like the hands, there is no lume on any hour markers. The noticeably scratched crystal covering the dial is just a mineral crystal, and looking at the way it fits the case and the amount of scratches it's accumulated, I'd say it's the original one. It's when we take a look at the case surrounding that crystal that this watch really shows its age. That shape is unmistakably 70s, with its hooded lugs, sleek curves, and mirror polish on top. The case size comes in at an appropriately vintage 34mm, and the width of those hidden lugs is about 17mm. While small, the case shape does help it to wear a little larger than it actually is, feeling more like a 36mm watch. Being quartz, the watch is not very thick, coming in at 9mm. On top, we have a polished bezel, with a small chamfered edge on top that is brushed. The large top surface of the case is completely polished right up to the curved ends where it covers the lugs hidden underneath. A substantial bezel to the edge runs the length of the case and is brushed, as is the side of the case. On the side, we have a very small, very short crown that is polished. Flipping it over, we can see a press-on caseback with the Seiko logo and a serial number for the watch. This gives the watch just a water-resistant rating, but I wouldn't be taking this watch anywhere near water given its age. From other examples of this watch I've seen online, this seems to be the original bracelet that came with the watch, which is a little confusing considering the completely polished top does not match at all with the completely brushed finish of the bracelet. The design of the bracelet, however, matches the 70s style perfectly, and really reminds me of those elasticized metal bands on other vintage watches. As it leaves the case, the bracelet does taper from 17 to 16mm. It's only a 1mm taper, but at this width it is more noticeable. Each link is folded rather than solid, but that was standard practice at the time and nothing unusual. Even Rolex used this style of link right up to the 2000s. The clasp is simple but effective, carrying over the brushed finish from the bracelet. It maintains a thin profile by being a folded, pressed clasp and has 6 positions for micro-adjustment. These positions are almost redundant though, as the links themselves are already quite short and almost the same size as each micro-adjust position. Luckily though, the clasp was just long enough to fit my wrist using the last hole. I don't think it would be an easy task finding some extra links for this bracelet. Now, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. Obviously, the watch is small by modern standards, but after wearing 36mm watches like my Tudor and Orient, this 34mm doesn't feel that much smaller. I probably wouldn't go any smaller than this though. The case shape does also help to feel a little larger than it actually is. Due to the uncommon 17mm sizing, I don't have any other straps to show you on this watch, but I think a brown leather would work really well with the green dial. Being quartz, it's not a heavy watch and also stays quite thin, making it very comfortable to wear. The short links of the bracelet also really conform to the shape of my 7-inch wrist. So, going back to my original question at the beginning of the video, do they really not make them like they used to? Looking at the case and bracelet, they sure don't, but some would argue that's a good thing. The folded links and pressed clasp, while still present on budget watches, are a relic best left in the past in my opinion. That 70s case design is something that's very subjective too. However, it's a different story when it comes to what's inside that case. Looking from the front, we see the second hand hitting all the minute markers perfectly, with no perceivable bounce back, something that can't be said for modern cheap quartz movements. The care and effort that went into the manufacture of this movement compared to ones mass-produced today is not comparable. Add to that the fact that this movement can be completely disassembled and serviced and you really do have a watch that's built different. There aren't really any issues I have with this watch when I keep in mind its age. Of course, I bought this second hand, and it has lived a well-loved life before I got it, acquiring scratches and marks all over the crystal, case and bracelet. The size is appropriate for the time that it came from, and, love it or hate it, the case design is definitely eye-catching and unique. There is a lot to like though: a well-made case and movement, a fantastic green dial, and all the charm and history of an almost 50-year-old watch. How many quartz watches made today will still be running flawlessly 45 years from now? What do you think about this watch? Have you got a vintage Seiko quartz model? What do you think about the case shape and design? Is it too small? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.